G'day everyone from Australia. My name's Rob Stokes and it's a great pleasure to present to you whatever it is time in Mexico. It's sort of late morning here in Sydney, Australia. I'm going to present in relation to what we have learned in the Australian state of New South Wales, which in many ways is very different to your state, but there are some similarities in relation to the range of climate and some of the urban typographies which are shared. So my background to speak to you today, I spent about 10 years variously as the Minister for Environment, for Planning, for Heritage, for Public Spaces, for Infrastructure, for Cities, for Transport and for Roads. So land use and urban land use and how to effectively get the mix right between development, between productivity, between great residential outcomes and great open spaces is something that I've been very focused on. In fact, I understand that I was the first ever person to be appointed to a specific ministry for public spaces. And the reason for that was quite simply, as we were trying to make the case, particularly in the cities of Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong, which are undergoing fast rates of population growth, we wanted to make the case that while we increased opportunities for urban renewal, that would be matched with parkland renewal and bushland renewal all at the same time. And effectively, my talk will be about the way in which we reconceived of Sydney in particular, as pictured in that first slide, from a city with parks to a city in a park. Next slide, please. So according to the UN Habitat's latest report card, progress towards sustainable urban development is outpaced by urban malignancy. The world is creating new slum dwellers faster than it can address existing slums. We're generating about 2.5 billion tonnes of urban solid waste, about half of which is deposited in open dump sites. And 99% of the world's urban population live in areas that exceed the World Health Organization's standards for what's safe in terms of air pollution. And the burning of residential fuel consumption and waste burning and power generation is responsible for about 4.2 million deaths every year, let alone motor vehicle accidents that account for about 1.3 million deaths each year in our cities. Cities are responsible for about 70% of the world's carbon emissions, which are already 150% higher than pre-industrial levels. So while cities are growing faster, wider and denser, they're growing so faster than our capacity to address the environmental problems that they create. We are globally getting better in terms of developing in ways that align with sustainable urban development. The problem is the rate of growth is outpacing our capacity to resolve them. Next question. Next slide. In the case of Sydney, it's an exquisite irony that our population is starting to accelerate just as we're starting to experience the consequences of human-induced climate change. The slide here is of a beachfront just north of Sydney called Womberal, where a seawall built in the 1960s and 1970s is eroding in the face of what we call East Coast lows, which are significant coastal storms that are being accelerated in their ferocity as a result of climate change. Next slide. This is an image of Sydney recorded during the Eastern Australian fires of 2019-2020 that burned through more than 1 million square kilometres of the east coast of Australia, and that's the smoke haze generated, which created, as you could imagine, incredibly unsafe levels of air pollution. Next slide. This is a picture of the flooding caused in the Hawkesbury area northeast of Sydney. This is slated for very extensive residential subdivision and development, and is exposed to increasing flood risk. The point of these last three slides is to demonstrate, and these were all slides. The Wombrel storm erosion I showed you was 2019. The next slide were floods in 2020 and fires in 2019, 2020, and these floods in this slide were in 2021, 2022. So I think in many urban centres, Sydney included, we're a little like frogs being slowly boiled. We don't realise that we are already living with the consequences of climate change, and our urban infrastructures and services are not prepared for the rate of change that we're going to face. And this is already having significant impacts in terms of infrastructure costs as well as insurance liabilities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is a residential subdivision in the outskirts of Sydney. It seems that the more we learn, the little we practice what we've come to understand. As our houses are getting bigger, our subdivision patterns are getting smaller as land values become as land values increase. These are the patterns of subdivision that we need to confront and we need to overturn. I'm pleased to say that this subdivision pattern related to a period before I was the minister, I hasten to add, but these are some of the legacies that we're having to deal with. As you can imagine, in areas of Sydney, a little like your state, it can get very hot. In areas like this, completely denuded of a tree canopy, these homes are entirely reliant on mechanical ventilation, heating and cooling systems, which are recurrently expensive to operate and expose the people living in these areas to heightened risks associated with the urban heat island effect in particular. I think perhaps the best way to summarise the last few slides goes to the US author Naomi Klein, who once dramatically put it, "Our economy is at war with many forms of life on Earth, including human life. What the climate needs to avoid collapse is a contraction of humanity's use of resources, but what our economic model demands to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one of these sets of rules can be changed, and it's not the laws of nature." In other words, the way in which we develop and the way in which we develop economic wealth and prosperity needs to change in order that we don't exceed the planetary limits to growth. In many ways, we planned our cities this way. In one normative conception, cities are designed to protect us from the world around us, which I think is graphically exposed by this photograph of Hong Kong, where you can see the light trespass and the city is almost at war with its surroundings. Like a city wall protected townsfolk from a hostile hinterland, today's urban dwellers live separated from the wild and uncontrollable natural world outside the city limits. There's a stark difference between cities and nature. And like the natural world, cities are confected. To ancient Jewish writers, perfection was a garden, while cities like Babylon were symbols of human oppression, arrogance, and pride. Next slide. Under this normative model, cities are mechanistic and inhuman. This is a photo of Metropolis, a utopian early film of the early 20th century. Architects like Le Corbusier, for example, focused on very Fordist or very mechanistic views of urban development. Rectangular street pattern building block of the city since ancient times, simply in the words of Lewis Mumford, monotonous grids of expediency. Our cities were sort of separated according to, again, Fordist principles of planning. Hippodamus of Miletus, credited by Aristotle as the inventor of urban planning, imposed order not just through grids, it's known as the Hippodamian grid, but also dividing citizens into classes: soldiers, artists, and husbandsmen, and land was divided into three categories: sacred, public, and private. Concentric zoning models today were devised by technocrats, particularly engineers, who were seeking to separate land according to use. So you had your residential zones, your commercial zones, your industrial zones, and people themselves who were often divided according to class, gender, or even race. And that is the model that continues to shape many cities, particularly cities of the global north, but some of those development models have been imported right around the world. Homes became machines for living. Cities themselves were also growth machines, engines for economic prosperity, but only for really urban elites. The global cities became wired, technological, connected, but clinical. There wasn't really much space for humanity. The machine cities became wonderlands of what light, steel, and glass, but they're all the same wherever they are. So big, bland, and generic that the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas said that the city become like an addicted and fabricated machine from which there's no escape. But fortunately, there's another way to look at cities, and that's sort of indicated by the next slide. The next slide. That shows an early model by the Scottish planner, Patrick Geddes, and he originally trained as a botanist, and he saw cities rather than as machines, but as organisms, that they were complex interlinking systems that developed dynamically together. The idea was that cities were not so much as at war with nature, but an expression of nature. That just like the humans that make up the city, that are the city, that full of wonder, creativity, complexity, and imperfection, well, our cities are shaped the same way. Building on this understanding, and this is shown on the next slide, Ebenezer Howard, an English planner, sought to bring towns together, bringing the best of the city and the country together in what he called garden cities. It's sort of a paradox in a way that you have both a garden and the city in the same place. But that became the model of development that was designed to bring both the best of the country and the best of the city together in this sort of organic expression of what a city should look like. But while it sounds wonderful and sounds utopian, the idea that people would have access to nature, but also be proximate to schools, to healthcare, to jobs, to other opportunities, the lived expression became a little different, as shown in the next slide. This is a map of Levittown in Pennsylvania, and this was a subdivision inspired by garden suburbs thinking. Rather than being a garden, they really became what Christopher Alexander called like an artificial city, an automaton. It might function smoothly, but there's no life in it. The suburban experiment just produced a standardized and denatured environment, just as compromised as the mechanistic model it was designed to replace. Rather than embracing all urban dwellers, these garden suburbs sort of just became a green ghetto dedicated to the elite and an asylum for the preservation of illusion. That rather than being a garden in a genuine sense, a blending of humanity and nature, it became a sterilized version of really nothingness. Next slide. So these are a mud map. When I first became Minister for Planning in New South Wales, I sort of thought, well, how do we make the city today? How do we bring together these paradoxes that we want jobs, we want growth, but we want to protect our natural environment. We want to celebrate the natural systems that surround us and embrace them as part of the city, but also find ways in which we can address urban inequality, that we can ensure that the benefits of nature around us are available to all, and that they support rather than hinder economic growth, equality, and better, healthier lifestyles. Remembering that a better embrace of nature actually has remarkable impacts in terms of health budgets. In the case of New South Wales, for example, a bit over, and I imagine it might be the same in your state, about a third of our state budget is spent treating on healthcare, and about 80% of our health budget is spent addressing non-communicable disease, the biggest one of which is type 2 diabetes, followed closely by cardiovascular disease. And a big cause or a contributing factor in relation to these conditions is lack of capacity to do incidental exercise. Again, because of the way in which we built our cities to exclude nature rather to embrace it. So this mud map was designed to look at the way in which we could bring nature in and conceive of that idea I started with of a city in a park. Next slide. And that's its translation into reality. We split Sydney into effectively 3 cities: a harbour city, a central river city, and a western parkland city. The western parkland city based around a new airport. But you can see those green wedges surrounding that image. That was a really important part of the expression of these places, to bring nature in and embrace it as part of the urban form. Next slide. As we progressed, we realised that when we went to a final level of granularity, we saw all these incredible urban green spaces, spaces that were left behind in the rush to develop throughout the 20th century. Because land was cheap and the motor car made outward expansion easy, areas that were more difficult to develop were simply left behind, but stayed as empty, unused green spaces that we realised could be reimagined, not just as the Hippodamian grid of streets and of concrete pathways, but instead of green and blue pathways across the city. Next slide. To the east, we put investments along the coastline in a range of active transport, whether they were bike paths or pedestrian pathways, to make it easier for people to access the beaches and the coast and walk along the coast. Next slide. We also saw a network of parks that could be produced between the harbour city and the river city to recognise that there were all sorts of ways in which we could make it easier for people to progress along a green spine, linking together along abandoned causeways or riparian corridors or canals, and reimagine them as active linear parks and spaces for people to ride, people to walk, and people to recreate. Next slide. Again, through the west of the city, between the river city of Parramatta and the western parkland city, we made some strategic acquisitions to try and join together the parklands in a way to make sense of the bits that have been left behind. Next slide. And in the far west of the city, we built upon existing parklands from places like Penrith Lakes or along the Hawkesbury and Nepean rivers, many of which are flood prone, and recognised that those constraints to development around flooding, for example, provide a context for us to provide green and accessible places for the burgeoning population of Western Sydney. Next slide. This is a slide showing that the strategic acquisitions that we made during a period in government, looking at the way in which it had to be planned and it had to be funded, and we had to find ways in which we could use development outcomes to help us generate the capital to make the land acquisitions to provide the parklands that the new development required. Remembering in this part of Sydney, it's significantly affected by exposure to urban heat island effects. It's a very hot area in summer and a cold area in winter. So we wanted to regulate temperatures as much as we could by restoring a green canopy. Next slide. We also saw that while the north-south links, as I demonstrated to you, were reasonably easy to make, the east-west links were harder because the patterns of development had not left the same sorts of spaces in between. So we created a new agency called the Greater Sydney Parklands that brought together a range of existing disparate parklands, and the way in which we governed and managed these spaces changed. Rather than looking at the parks looking inward, and they all had their own management bodies to look at how to preserve these different parklands, instead we brought them together under single management so that they contract for things like gardening services and waste services and all those sorts of things. We saved considerable costs by bringing together back office functions, but had a strategic vision to generate income from these parks and use that income to purchase new parklands to try and bring these areas together. It builds upon, as you can see there in the light blue, the Parramatta River that stretches through the middle of the city, bringing together Centennial Parklands, Callan Park, Parramatta Park, the Western Sydney Parklands, and a newly acquired park called Fernhill Estate in the west. It's only the beginning of an east-west corridor, but the strategy is there. Next slide. We also looked at ways in which we could reimagine these places left behind. This is an old drainage corridor, a pipeline that we realised, well, why don't we just put a bike path and a pedestrian path next to it? And in so doing, we're able to capture huge benefits of people being able for short trips. In Sydney, for example, more than 2 million vehicle trips a day are less than 2 kilometres in duration. We can help address cost of living and also car dependency by bringing these connections to life. Next slide. There are also opportunities under existing freeways. This is a new freeway that was built, but part of what we did was to reimagine the space underneath as a new urban park. Next slide. There you can see that this was a tollway, so part of the business case to build that road required the restoration of the lands surrounding it into new urban parks. And incidentally, that parkland allows connectivity under that freeway to bring two existing suburbs together. Next slide. This slide and the one after shows a new investment in a linear park. These are important parklands, not so much the parks you might drive to, but rather the parks that are accessible immediately outside where people live to make it easier for them to walk and ride on those short local trips that bring things like the 15-minute city, for example, to life. Next slide. And you can see the transformation that's planned there. Next slide. Shows a similar treatment to a very much a Fordist park. That is a park that you drive to and recreate into a place that becomes part of the landscape and a transport route in its own right. Next slide. That shows the treatment of what is funded and is being delivered at that parkland right now. Next slide. During COVID, we realised that there was a really important opportunity to refocus public attention on the green and blue spaces that surrounded them. Those existing parklands and bits of unused space suddenly took on a new importance. When people were locked in their homes and couldn't use their motor cars, they could still walk around their local environment. We used that to inspire new investment into parklands that wouldn't have otherwise been possible to make, given that the preponderance of funding has traditionally gone to roads, not parks and pathways. Next slide. We made a clear decision to plant in Greater Sydney between 2019 and 2022 1 million trees, and that the success of that program. Next slide. Next slide. The success of that program meant that we're now going to plant 5 million trees across Greater Sydney by 2030. We reached our target of 1 million trees planted by 2022. This slide is about a return and earn scheme. It's a container deposit scheme that if you return plastic bottles for recycling, you get a modest 10 Australian cents for every bottle that's returned. This was incredibly important in cleaning up our parks and waterways. About 40% of litter volumes immediately disappeared because we gave an economic value to waste that had previously been thrown away. Next slide. And again, there's more examples of the tree planting activities. We made that a community activity, brought communities together and funded local community groups to plant trees and also to tend them as they grew. Next slide. We also worked with local communities to help them identify new walking and cycling routes to link their communities. This is an example of the Great West Walk, a community-led initiative that only required a very modest amount of government funding, where a whole bunch of local community groups, neighbours got together to identify and plot new ways of walking and cycling around their communities, again, to avoid the use of motor cars and use existing green spaces. Next slide. This is the Hawthorn Canal in Western Sydney. It's an abandoned drainage canal. It's now in the process of being reimagined as a walking and cycling route, linking across between Sydney Harbour and Botany Bay. Next slide. This is a new walking and cycling route linking to the central CBD of Parramatta, Sydney's second city, the really the demographic heart of the metropolis. And next slide. And that shows that that link having now been delivered. That now allows great walking and cycling access into an area that was choked by traffic, and bicycle and pedestrian counts are showing that it has an appreciable impact in changing transport mode from driving into Parramatta to walking and cycling into Parramatta. Next slide. This is the Caddy Freeway in the US state of Texas, and it demonstrates that that I think at its widest point it's 26 lanes of traffic wide. They're very, very expensive, and by continuing to add to our urban freeway network, we're actually not building the freedom of citizens, but rather enslaving them to motor vehicles. Instead of these investments that are colossally expensive and generally run over budget and over time, pretty much over cost and over time in every project in our experience, we find that that investments in green and blue infrastructure, in cycleways, in pedestrian parks and paths, always, in our experience, have come in either on or under budget. They're much less complex to deliver, and they provide a much bigger bang for buck. As part of our business case processes, our cost benefit analysis generally shows that walking and cycling benefits return about 5 times their cost in benefits, whereas over time, freeways have generally returned less than twice their benefits in terms of the costs. For a very, very small investment, we can have a very, very big impact on the shape of our cities. Next slide. So to conclude, our experience in conceiving of Sydney and other cities in New South Wales as not having parks in a city, but rather being a city in a park, changes the way in which we think about urban infrastructure. Rather than thinking of urban infrastructure as only big mega projects based around roads, instead by a whole series of small grassroots community-led projects can have really significant productivity impacts, really significant equity impacts, and really significant health impacts. The example of Sydney shows it can be done, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper than spending scarce infrastructure dollars on mega projects that generally, in our experience, run over budget every time. Thank you for the opportunity to participate, and I wish you all the very best as you plan a green future and a park future for your wonderful state and jurisdiction and its wonderful cities. Thanks for having me.